When you hear concentration camp, you probably think of Nazi Germany or Communist Russia, where people were slaughtered en masse. However, Japan had its equivalent, Unit 731, where experiments were conducted on civilians with hundreds of thousands of victims. In retrospect, this can be compared to a macabre competition, where creativity in inflicting death was judged. However, we will not concern ourselves with judging who won in this competition, but will answer some questions, among others. What did the facility look like? What was the flour from the ticks for them? And how did we avoid a deadly epidemic thanks to one man? But before we start, a little history. Before Unit 731 was created, the Japanese respected human rights. During the war, they showed respect and provided shelter to surrendering enemies. So, how did such a drastic change occur? A biological weapons enthusiast, Ishii, a military medic and microbiologist, appeared. He saw great potential in pathogens and chemical weapons, so he asked the command to create a unit for this research. He gained full support, as the command saw this as a way to reduce the cost of maintaining the military. Researchers were sent to the West to gain as much information as possible about biological weapons. Ishii naturally went with them and spent 2 years over there, and upon his return, had many ideas. Nevertheless, to realize them, all Shiro needed was a place to experiment and lab rats. Fortunately for him, Japan was at war with China at the time, which made it possible to set up a unit in the conquered territory, where a puppet state was established in 1932, Manchukuo, from which they drew benefits such as coal, iron, and people to experiment on for Shiro. The first center was large and was built on the grounds of a village from where the residents had been forced out. It was equipped with barbed wires, guards, and prisoners were brought in cattle cars. Conditions inside were better than in Nazi camps, as the prisoners were provided with relatively good living conditions, and the food was a bit like a balanced diet, although they had their legs chained all the time. Such conditions were maintained to make the results of experiments as reliable as possible. And what kind of experiments were conducted? In the beginning, the experiments involved testing human toughness. One of the experiments was to drop half liter of blood every few days, which is about 1/10 of all our blood, which takes much longer to reconstitute than those few days. So people subjected to this experiment did not even survive a month. They were also curious about how much a person is able to survive on water alone. They tested with mineral and distilled water, but you can guess the finale. In 1936, something happened that they didn't expect. Many prisoners escaped, so they were forced to take everything they could and wash out of there. The unit was moved near the city of Harbin, about 100 kilometers farther than its previous location. There, they built an even larger facility covering as much as 6 square kilometers, the equivalent of 840 football fields. They've improved security to ensure that a similar incident doesn't happen. In addition, they changed the style of cell construction. They still provided heat and fresh air, but 2 openings were made in the doors. One barred and the other low to the ground with a flap so that barely alive prisoners could get another shot. They started testing with many diseases, but focused on the likes of plague, cholera, and hemorrhagic fever. However, in addition to diseases, they were also interested in dealing with frostbite, which Shiro thought would be very important if they were to wage war against Russia, which is characterized by harsh winter. Then, as I started about frostbite, how did they do this research? First, they had to cause frostbite, for which they needed frost outside or in a freezer. To speed up the process, they would uncover the limbs and pour water over them. If ice formed on them, it was broken up and the procedure was repeated until, if they tapped an arm or leg with a stick, it made a sound of hitting the board. Then, such a person was taken away and various methods of treatment were tested For example, leaving such a person overnight without treatment, or pouring hot water over them, or exposing their limbs over a fire. These experiments often ended with muscles falling off the bones or the bones crumbling themselves, after which they always got gangrene. Did it achieve anything? Well, yes, we now know that it is best to give such a limb to water at 37 to 40 degrees Celsius. However, the price for this knowledge was very high. But if what was told before has shocked you, then you need to hear about the use of the diseases I mentioned. Let's move on to the plague, because the Japanese saw great potential in it. They started infecting prisoners and quickly learned that autopsy on the dead didn't make much sense because the flesh began to decompose very quickly. They thought about it, looked at each other, and decided that they would perform vivisections, that is, cutting up people who were still alive. When someone was dying, they would take them on a table and immobilize them and then open them up and see what it all looked like. They would examine how the disease worked on the organs, and if they wanted a closer look, they would cut it out. Yet testing at the facility alone wasn't enough for Ishii, so it was time for field work. The first target was one of the districts of Ningbo, over which a plane flew in 1940, leaving behind a cloud of rat bait along with plague germs. After just a few days, they killed more than 100 people, and the district itself was closed for 20 years. 2 years later, in 1942, they repeated the maneuver, which was overseen by Ishii himself. He was most likely pleased, as 400 people died in a short period of time, and in the same short period of time, the men of the 731 showed up. They set up a makeshift laboratory for themselves where they examined the corpses and spread the word among residents that if they came to them, professional medical help would be provided. If that's what you can call rag to mouth and slicing alive. But let's move on to something more precise. This is what Ishii most likely thought as he ordered his men to design bombs, or rather ceramic containers, to contain pathogens, fleas, or insects such as mosquitoes. They would drop these little infected blood-sucking beasts at a selected point, from which people were hung on crosses at various distances. They secured their chests and heads so that they wouldn't accidentally get hit by shrapnel from some projectiles that were being tested in the area. However, their arms and legs remained uncovered so that mosquitoes would have no trouble stinging them. These, let's not be afraid to say it, psychopaths also had a quick response to disease news. When an epidemic of hemorrhagic fever broke out during the construction of the railroad route linking Russia and Manchukuo, they got there as fast as they could. And the whole thing was described in Japanese scientific and medical journals of the time. You could read how the researchers first collected rats and pulled the ticks off them. And then they would grind them into flour to clean them with saline, and then inject such a solution into the monkeys. If any of them showed the desired symptoms, their organs were ground up and injected into the next one. So on and on until they isolated the pathogen they wanted. You're probably wondering, where did they get the monkeys? Well, out of nowhere, because everyone quickly realized that it wasn't monkeys but humans. Everybody knew it, but nobody did anything about it. If we are still at diseases, venereal diseases were not to be missed. They checked how they were transmitted. For this task, they infected men with syphilis and forced them to rape women and men. Meanwhile, the rapes themselves were a daily occurrence, as the guards, who were officially forbidden to have contact with prisoners outside their duties, forced the women to have intercourse. If any of them became pregnant, the psychos had many ideas for tests with her as the lead. They infected them with diseases, dropped them from heights, and wounded them with white, firearms, or chemical weapons. Their creativity also reached into X-ray. Indeed, they subjected people to multiple X-rays until they developed radiation sickness, which they also studied. Likewise, they wanted to see how much an airplane pilot or parachutist was capable of. They used spinning machines for this, into which a prisoner was put and started spinning faster and faster. They stopped only when the person fainted or died, which usually happened at a force of 10 to 15 Gs. Let's now turn to the career of Ishii himself, as he almost led a huge epidemic. He was promoted so many times that he became an advisor to the boss who carried out the attack on the US. Ishii was horny about the whole operation and proposed dropping germs over major cities and landing sick people by suicide. Was the project rejected? Well, not really, because initially everyone liked it and it was accepted. It's just that the head of the general staff was left out of the process, who, when he found out about it, said that everyone here was going nuts. After all, if the epidemic spreads to the rest of the world, there will be a war between humans and germs, and the latter may win. The worst part of it all would be that it would be the fault of Japan, whose honor would be tarnished. However, all good things come to an end quickly. As the war drew to a close, all those involved in the operation of Unit 731 had to clean up their act and go underground. However, many of them, including Shiro Ishii, decided to profit from the information they gathered. They sold it to the Americans, among others, and stayed employed in state institutions. No one still has suffered any responsibility for the horrors they committed. Ishii himself died of throat cancer in 1959 with immunity from the Americans. Today, there are people who participated in all this and apologize for what happened, but this will not make up for the suffering of the people who went through it. Thanks for watching. Share your opinion in the comments, leave a like, and subscribe to the channel. Take care and see you in the next video.